In Canada, it is apparently freedom of speech to speak out against Islam and Muslims, but a hate crime to speak out against Israel? It seems that's the direction the Canadian government is headed. The CBC, Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government, according to the CBC, is threatening to use hate crime laws against groups that boycott Israel. The CBC says that, quote, such a move by Harper's government could target a range of civil society organizations from the United Church of Canada and the Canadian Quakers to campus protest groups and labor unions. If carried out, it would be a remarkably aggressive tactic and another measure of the Conservative government's lockstep support for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, this is the same government that called the Charlie Hebdo attacks on freedom and free speech. I was joined earlier by Yara Shoufani, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions activist, or BDS activist. She's also a student at McMaster's University, and I began by asking her to explain what BDS is all about.
So the BDS movement stands for Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. What this movement is trying to do is it's basically saying that we want to institutions and individuals, and as well as our countries, to boycott, divest, and sanction from any companies or institutions that are directly involved in Israel's occupation of Palestine. So a good example for that could be HP. HP currently is used at the Israeli checkpoints, which are illegal under international law. So we're asking, like on a university level, we'd be asking for our institution to stop buying from and divest from HP in order to respect the Palestinians' rights to freedom of movement.
So what's really fascinating about the situation, as I understand it, what's happening in Canada and really in other places as well, because we talked about in the lead up to this email exchange between a CBC reporter in Canada, Neil MacDonald, and the spokesman for the Public Safety Department, and essentially stating that the Harper government is going to do exactly what the CBC reported, which is namely citing various criminal hate speech laws when asked what specifically the Canadian government would do to enforce what it's calling a zero-tolerance policy against advocates for boycotting Israel. But everything you're doing here is about nonviolent expression and refusing to purchase from companies that support what you call occupation. Is that essentially it?
Exactly. So, I mean, it's very ironic. Like what we're advocating for a system against a system of racism. So it's to turn around and say that what we're doing is somehow close to hate speech. I mean, it's relatively terrifying. Just last year, our former foreign minister, or Minister of Foreign Affairs, John Baird, actually signed a declaration with the State of Israel. And I can quote a little bit from it right here. It says that they are deeply concerned by efforts to single out the State of Israel internationally, including calls for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and that they say that participants will work together to oppose efforts to single out Israel through developing an initiative to oppose boycotts of Israel. So, I mean, our government in Canada, and I know that in the U.S., they're doing the same thing, is actually directly engaging in suppression of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is it's really ironic considering that we live in a country that's currently has been occupying other places in the world in the name of democracy, right? So they're trying to suppress a movement of activists that are precisely standing for international law and for justice.
The situation with the Charlie Hebdo newspaper, where obviously the Canadian Prime Minister had talked about the importance of freedom of speech. In France, there was a lot of talk about this all across Europe and in the United States. In France alone, more than 20 BDS activists have been convicted under a similar law to what they're talking about in Canada. And again, this goes back to this same issue. I guess the question is, are you all having an effect on these companies? Are you seeing momentum behind what you're doing? Because it would seem to me that if you are ineffective and no one's paying attention, that these companies and these governments would have no interest in you. And yet suddenly there is a movement of creating legislation coupled with a lot of kind of ratcheting up of talk about hate speech. What kind of success are you all seeing, if you're having any?
Well, I mean, the success of BDS can be scaled on two different ways. So first of all is the economic success. So we're seeing the economic success. An example could be SodaStream. SodaStream, after a great deal of BDS activists protesting against SodaStream and pushing companies to stop selling SodaStream in their stores, SodaStream actually had their stocks plunge, and they've announced that they'll be closing their factory, which is located in a settlement. So there is an economic success, but the economic success is not the major or focal point of BDS. It's more so BDS is spreading so quickly. In the past 9 years, I would have never said, like, someone had asked any BDS activist 9 years ago whether they saw potential for this movement to spread the way it has. People probably wouldn't have been extremely hopeful. And yet 9 years later, we're seeing BDS spreading all over the world, essentially. People are becoming extremely educated on these issues as a result of BDS. So when I look at it from a university perspective, at our university, we had a BDS vote, and where 622 students voted yes for BDS, and 28 voted no. So, I go to one of the largest universities in Canada, McMaster University. So we're seeing a huge, huge surge in support for Palestinian human rights and support for the BDS movement, because it is a nonviolent movement and it actually provides very viable solutions to Israel's occupation and apartheid. So there is a lot of successes, absolutely.
It sounds like it. Justin Trudeau, who's the leader of Canada's Liberal Party, came out against BDS, and he said this. He said, Canada will fight any efforts internationally to delegitimize the state of Israel, including what he called the disturbing BDS movement. And again, this comes back to what we were talking about a minute ago, in that it seems like there's a lot of momentum behind this. However, when you get down to the core of what you guys are talking about, the idea that you would criminalize the ability to boycott, criminalize freedom of speech, and they're calling it hate speech, but to say don't purchase from this company, that's practiced in every country in the world on a variety of levels, and it seems like you all are specifically being targeted for this. I'll give you the last word on it.
Yeah, I mean, I believe Canada currently is sanctioning 22 different countries, if I'm not mistaken, for human rights violations around the world. So, I mean, our Canadian government is most certainly they're not opposed to boycotts and sanctions in any way, since they're doing so themselves. So it's the selective sanctioning. They have a particular issue with us sanctioning or requesting that our government sanction, boycott, and divest from Israel with regards to specifically not Israel as a whole, but specifically companies that are engaging in human rights violations. So I mean, we can see clearly that our government is actually infringing on our rights by trying to sway the public to think that BDS is anything but a peaceful movement.
Yara Shoufani, student and BDS activist from Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.